Okay, here we go. Okay, so just to fully explain the Horror Advocate, the mission of the Horror Advocate, it's a hybrid advocacy and equity resource project that meets inequities at their root rather than their symptomatic effect. So all that really means is I'm interested in figuring out why things are happening and how we can combat them rather than being fixated on a problem per se. I'm much more about exploring things so that we can actually reach a conclusion and not just have circular arguments all the time, which is what it seems happens with anything that, we're trying to do as a community. There are 3 core programs to the Horror Advocate. One is called Rec Zombie. That is the archival and history resource that I've created about horror. So you can take a look at it. So I created this to combat basically the absence of horror and horror history in cinema, especially where accolades are concerned. So this entire piece of my project is about building archives that are both digital and physical. That's something I'm actually working on in this very moment with a library in Massachusetts. So we'll see how that goes. The Rec Retro Horror Awards is my retelling of the Academy Award system from start to finish. So that's something I'm working on again in the moment, where I would basically be looking at the Oscar winners and nominees. So we're going all the way back to 1932 when it started. So I'm going to go from 1932 to date and go over who has won awards and then explain the horror films from that year that probably should have gotten that award. So that's what that one's about. The Rec Zombie horror appreciation list is basically about giving horror its respect for being the creators of the film industry. We wouldn't have Tom Hanks, we wouldn't have Brooke Shields, we wouldn't even have Leonardo DiCaprio. All 3 of those people's careers started in horror. Those were their first major roles. And it's so interesting to me that we continue to leave that particular genre out of the discussion, because it's basically the only genre that's dedicated to indie creation and individuals and sort of unique concepts. So I wanted to be able to build that list out so people can actually see the impact of what that genre has actually done across the film industry. And then my recommendation list is taking a little longer because I have to build a back end to that, but the goal there would be to have a survey that people could fill out when they find my service, and I would be able to spit out 4 to 5 movies that I think they actually would want to watch. Something very important to me about recommendations is I'm not going to recommend something that I don't think you can stand. So for me, it's just another way to get people who think they don't like horror to understand how multifaceted it is and how big of a resource it is, and that you can get so much more out of it than what people are assuming. All of these slides are on my website. In the open document, there is a link to my whole website. So if you want to go through this on your own, you're more than welcome to do that. Apt Horror is my research resource. So the idea behind this part of my project is that I would create a survey and be able to distribute that across the internet. I'm not really concerned with a particular place right now. I just want it to be US based. So as much as I'm going to use the info I get from Massachusetts residents for my projects here, the goal is really to capture the entire country, how they're feeling about certain things. So this project starts in January. It goes for 6 months with this very, in-depth survey that essentially is one part what's your favorite movie, and the next part is do you live in an apartment or in a house, or do you have stairs? I get into those small things because I've realized those small details are actually what lead people to fully understanding it more. So the first half would be collecting all that data. Then I would spend the second half analyzing the data and figuring out what those top 3 concerns really look like. So that's the stage I'm in right now, just trying to figure out what those top ones are. And then I partner with a local community org, and then we do an event. So that's it's a year-long project that I'm going to run like that continuously. So I'm excited about this year because last year was trial. So I'm getting to the point now where I'm really able to make my mark and get people to help, because I have so much backing and so much work behind it at this point. So that's that one. Pop Cult Survivalist is my crime and pop culture project. So the idea behind this one is to explain how pop culture influences our justice system, our jury system, and how we perceive crimes, like what we think a crime actually is, who a victim is, what a victim is. Like all these things are actually being programmed through pop culture, not actually understanding crime. I have a master's in criminal behavior and criminal justice, so this is something that I've also kind of been working toward forever. So you can also view that on my website if you want to look at all the slides. So those are the three major like projects that I used. And then just to give you like a better view, this is my project map that I created. So what's in red is the parent project. So that's the horror advocate. And then what's in gray is the program that goes with it. And then the yellow is like my action items. So for Pop Cult Survivalists, like I do pop cult snapshots, which is sort of like taking a snapshot of a moment in history where crime was concerned and like putting it up against what was happening culturally at the moment or socially at the moment. That's what that one's about. I do the data gathering and analysis for that one too. The apt horror, the community survey, plus the event, and Rec Zombie has all these programmatic pieces. The Black Horror Survivors Movie Challenge is actually currently happening. So part of Rec Zombie is in full effect, which is very cool. This is just to give you an idea of like what my intended impact is across my whole project. So these are the three concerns I have when I created it. And this is what I want to affect or change about the country overall, but I'm happy to start just with Boston. And it's to nullify gatekeeping around community development and dialogue. So that's where the idea for apt horror came from. I want everyone to feel like they can actually be part of their own community. I think it's very interesting, a lot of things that have been happening in Boston, especially with, gentrification, and like people have been, forced out of neighborhoods they've lived in their whole lives. And it just seems like there's a very clear, distinct choice to make getting to those meetings of like city meetings or like communicating with city officials, like it's almost impossible. So it already leaves so many people out of the conversation. So my goal is to take my data and my research and actually build it up to be like something that a city official is going to want to look at before making choices, or just as part of a regular resource that they capture every year. So that is the ultimate goal for that. These are what I like to call my mind maps. This is my mind map of sort of the basic blueprints of horror, like location, sounds, atmosphere, narrative, like character, anti-hero. So those are very basic, like these are the things people already understand about horror, I think. These are things that you could easily explain to someone and they would understand how they fit. And then I start to get a little more granular, because I do like to explain to people how I'm seeing these films. So this is more about the subgenres that I'm trying to implement and that I appreciate and that I think help move things forward. So this mind map is all about that. Body horror does include pregnancy horror. Body horror does include like medical horror, things like that I think people aren't really thinking about too deeply, because their only understanding of a horror film is a slasher film, which, just for the record, I am obsessed with them, but there are other kinds. And I think that's just my goal, is to help people understand that it's much more vast than they would like to believe. This map explores what I like to call my belief systems. So this is how I'm framing all the work I'm doing. So in terms of belief systems, I'm very interested in like inconsistency. That is something I like think is a major problem, and not just in this world, but in the world overall. It's like the inconsistency of who is supported, who's not, what films are supported, which ones aren't. It's inconsistent and it's unclear. And so that's something I like to look at with my work. I'm actually doing a whole piece right now about the psychopathy of the American healthcare system. I'm actually working on a piece about that, where I'm looking really deeply into The Exorcist and the images from that film that we get that are more frightening than the ones that are happening in the house. Like the scenes when she's in the hospital are 10 times more effective, in my opinion, than the stuff that's happening in the house. I think it tells us a bigger story about what was going on at the time. So I like to keep that. My cat is screaming right now. But nope, not right now. So this mind map is about how I practice my work, if that makes sense, how I practice my work and the practices that I think would help people dig a little deeper. So I keep colorism in mind all the time, no matter what I'm doing, no matter what I'm looking at, whether it's very clear, specific horror that is focused on a racial issue, I always take that with me when I'm like viewing them and analyzing them. So that's something that matters to me. And I take all of these with me in this particular one. So that's that one. Man-made hell is one of my favorite maps that I created. I think it just really covers all the things that are not organic, but are completely destroying us. So that's the idea behind this one. Like, poverty is not organic. That's not just happening, you know? So that's why I like to keep that in the front of people's minds so I can attach that to things as well. This one is about institutions and industries that I look at when I do my work. So, you know, education, climate change, mental health. These are all things that I feel like can be very deeply explored by horror and not really many other genres. I think other genres can certainly tackle a topic, but I don't think they can be as effective because it has to be grounded in like so much realism that maybe it doesn't feel right, or you're not giving it enough realism and it feels ridiculous. So I think horror is the only one that really is able to strike that balance that actually produces impact on a person. Core struggles of existence. So that's the ego, sustainability, trauma and addiction, very focused on those issues in my work as well. So yeah, sample content. Right now I am doing the Black Horror Survivors Movie Challenge, and it is going to go from until October. It started in February and it's going to go till October. And these are some of the content pieces I released for that. So I was just going to play one and let you guys kind of see what I'm up to. These are also going to be available after if you'd like to see them again.
Where we begin, Black horror history and the legacy of Freaks. Freaks was so disturbingly ahead of its time that audiences stayed away in huge numbers. Many found it exploitative, abhorrent, and loathsome. Today, the film is widely praised for its commitment to diverse bodies and abilities. On a deeper note, the film gives presence to the Black body in the act of revolution, strategic equity warfare. In 1932, America's obsession with bringing Black bodies to pasture evolved under the guise of protection. The Tuskegee study is one of the first organized portraits of medical barbarism and exploitation. The 600 Black male participants were deceived, misguided, and exposed to the calculated determination that our bodies were test sites. Freaks is an imperative response to our bond with violence and chaos, and the misguided assertion that we can spot a villain from a distance.
Okay. So that's just a piece of content I created to explain why Freaks is an important piece to like Black horror cinema, even though upon first glance, it seems like it's unrelated. But those images are a big deal, like being able to see that firsthand and being able to attach that to a film. Like this is 1932. So this whole belief that like the only place in horror that Black people have is like the first victim, like that's essentially what I'm trying to combat or come up against or introduce people to new ideas around that. Because while that rule isn't necessarily false, it's almost like a false flag in a sense, because it makes you think that's the only time, way, or, you know, shape that you're going to see a Black body when it comes to horror. So I really wanted to just change that perspective and share all the things that I know and that I've seen, because most people who don't understand the genre have also refused to watch any of it. So it's being able to like share all this information for somebody who's watching them all the time. I think it makes a huge difference in softening those edges for people. So these ones are also the same. This link is actually in the document. I recently won an award for an essay I wrote about Jordan Peele Black bodies and the Black American nightmare. That's listed in the document, I believe, as well, if you want to read it. But just an idea of like how I form everything around these ideas. So not just when I'm making that kind of content, but also when I'm writing an essay or like a poem, like these things still come up for me. This is just a quick ad of the Black horror movie survival challenge. So I'll play that.
I don't want to be the news. Besides, brothers don't last long in situations like this. National television.
So that's the ad that I've been using and like sharing with people and sharing around to get people interested in it. And so far, so good, especially in the horror community. They appreciate it. This is an excerpt from a presentation I did last year at the 30th anniversary Candyman conference. I did a whole project on how Candyman treats tragedy and villainy. And I connected that to basically the onslaught of false reports we've had in our culture around it was a Black guy. So I didn't include this slide, but you can look at that as well. But it's essentially covering this idea of like what this film is addressing the world we were living in at the time. I mean, Candyman came out 6 months after the Rodney King incident. And I that is like the connection there is just unreal. So as much as I'm sure like he couldn't have predicted that that release date would be so significant, like culturally, it's probably one of the most important things that we're not seeing and that we're not taking from horror film. And I wanted to share that at the conference, and it went really well. So this is just an excerpt from like one page where I was discussing, you know, how Helen deals with basically turning human beings into test subjects and not really seeing that these are human beings until she ends up in a situation where she's violated. Then suddenly she understands that. And so I wanted to share that as well. Current events, yeah. So this is happening right now. That's a current event. This is an event that is coming up. This is a 3-part series that I've been designing. That will focus on the justice system, harm reduction, the death penalty, and America's like obsession with crime and violence. Because if you actually do research, like the number of people who were killed on screen in Saving Private Ryan greatly outweighs any opening scene from any horror film in terms of like the number of deaths. So I really want to get into this idea of like people only being comfortable with violence on their terms and only willing to interpret it on their terms. So that whole thing is going to be about talking about all these issues. It definitely will go into my ideas about being granular and trying to attack something at the root. Like, I'm not really interested in the fact that like people are going to jail. I'm interested in why, and I'm interested in what we can implement to lessen that reality. So that's what that's going to be about. This is the ad that I created for that, which you can see. And I always put warnings on my stuff because I'm not trying to traumatize anybody. I always tell people to talk to me before they look at anything or watch anything, and not to just, because I'll tell you whether I think it's something that you can handle. I'm releasing my first report for Pop Cult Survivalist this year, so that's exciting. I'll probably be done with that at the end of the month, and I'll release it on my website. So those are things. Yeah, so I know this is a vampire class, so I did want to kind of do like an interactive activity with this. I think there's a link in the open document for you guys to do like a small voting thing. So you can find it. It should look like
It's the top 7 vampire films.
yes. Well, no, wait, does it say? Is that right? It's so hard to see. Fun fact also, my eyesight was actually ruined by Midsommar. So in a lot of ways, the fact that that movie's about like empathy and like feeling other people's pain, like it literally took half my eyesight. So I have had trouble seeing ever since. Don't know why.
I think the document open. Maybe you can see it.
Oh, I can't see. Oh, this one. Okay. It's class activity. Sorry, it's a class activity link, not the top 7 link.
She like put herself in like painful situations.
Yeah, it's the one with
Acting
names,
out
pronouns,
herself in
questions,
it where
comments.
it's
Is that
like,
it?
and then Never played a character that did so much fighting before.
All right, I found it.
Oh, no.
Can you hear me, Abby?
Yeah,
All right, I think I found it. So would you like me to send this to the class, or what would be the best way to
yeah.
just?
I was thinking like, it's meant to be like a vote thing and the results will like show up here. I just like to gather data everywhere I go. So the link in the open document that says class activity, everyone should be able to click that and vote through and they will show up here.
Okay, I can send an email right now, put it out here and.
You can also, I mean, this is also something you could do it later and like share the info with me. I just wanted to give everyone a chance to sort of like.
Okay, absolutely. So let's do that. I'll send out all these links after the.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Oh no. Where's my website? Okay, here we go. Okay, well, this depicts my personal favorites. I'm very much a lover of older horror films. It's something that I try to get people into just as much. So this is just a listing of those, my personal top 7, not exactly in order though, but just the ones that have affected me the most. And if I had to pick one that was honestly the most effective on me, it's probably this one, Let's Scare Jessica to Death, because I don't think anyone even knows this is a vampire film unless they've like really delved into it. And probably Daughters of Darkness is something I also love. And 30 Days of Night is for me the most current vampire film that worked for me. I like vampires to be vicious. I think there's a place like Dracula's Daughter. Like, I think there's a place for this kind of thing, but I like, you know, the 30 Days of Night vampires actually scared me. So I appreciated that. This is just a clip of the trailer, and this is a excerpt from an article I wrote for Gore Culture where I was just talking about the film. So this also gives you an idea of what I write for the website. I do lists, I do like deep dives into subject matters, but this is kind of like my sweet spot, like taking something and boiling it down so that it translates to somebody who doesn't necessarily watch these films as something other than a horror film. Like I know that it is one, and I want them to feel that way, but I like to make sure that they can understand all the facets that go into it, and just all the details and just how powerful they are as films, and that they deserve much more recognition. So that's the general premise of my project. I can also share all my contact info. Again, I'll make the slides available. So that's really it. That was like a really quick, this is what I do. But if anyone has a question, I'm happy to try to answer one now. And again, you can contact me like anytime. I'm pretty responsive.
Thank you so much, Avi. I had one question actually, or one curiosity, because one thing that stood out to me when I was going through some of your work was when you were looking at a scene from, I think it was Friday the 13th, 6 or 7, but the scene where there's a Black boy who survives in his conflict with Jason, and looking at this sort of image of survival. And I'd love to hear your take. You mentioned it a little bit when you were talking about the Freaks movie, but about taking films that don't seem like they're positioned to speak to Black audiences and the cultural politics of Black life, and then sort of twisting them around and reading them in ways that show the importance they have for thinking about. I just love to hear a little bit more about that. It sounds like you're doing the exercises as well. So
yeah, especially with that video, that was the first piece of content that I created for the movie challenge. And it was important to me because I also wanted to show how horror can be healing, even if it's not current. Like for, maybe I'll play the video too. It's like really short, but I'll play it so everybody knows exactly.
The horror genre is notorious for exploring topics other genres can never touch. This scene in particular has been especially healing in the years after Trayvon Martin's gruesome murder. Horror gives us what many genres cannot: a historical portrait of a Black child and his hood, a hero instead of a threat.
Yeah, so the idea behind that is to realize like even past imagery or like past situations or past cultural moments can help deal with current ones. And so that connection was really important to me. And especially like I'm doing a lot of work around Black kids in horror and their survival rates and like how they make it through these films. And it's fascinating because a lot of them do make it out. And that's another thing where I don't think they're being counted in this idea of like how Black people are depicted in films. They tend to be the ones who like solve whatever's going on and or push it forward. They tend to be fearless. They tend to be very oriented in everyone's survival. And so I think it's really important for people to kind of just get it through their heads that this is a person and that these images, while they're manufactured, can absolutely help you like understand and deal with your own reality. And for me, like after that incident did happen, like I did watch this movie a lot. I watched this movie a lot, and I watched The People Under the Stairs, which has another young Black kid as the like hero of the film. So those things were really helpful to me when all that was going down. And so I wanted to share how and why that worked for me with that video.
I love that. I have one more question, and just sort of building off of that. It seems so interesting that both what I'm hearing in your kind of work is being able to see within horror important moments where Black characters survive, and to be able to share that with viewers and help undo that stereotype about Black characters all dying first. It also sounds like in your interest in 30 Days of Night, which is a movie that also really horrifies me, your appeal and desire for images of monstrosity. And that's something we've been thinking about a lot in this course, the toggle between the vampire as an image of restraint, is the ability to sort of embody monstrosity for Black vampires as well. And so I would just love to hear maybe a little bit about your takes on those, the sort of interplay between those two roles in horror, between the desire for images of survival versus the desire also for images of monsters, maybe.
Yeah. For me, I very much identify with a lot of the monsters in a horror film more than I do with a lot of the like subject matters or other characters. I think that monstrosity is something that we're unwilling to see as a potential positive. And I think that's sort of what I'm trying to dig into as well, because monstrosity in a lot of cases, especially in our culture and our society, is simply placed because you're not willing to be walked all over, because you're not willing to submit to whatever role has been created for you by society. Like that can turn someone into a monster as far as everyone's concerned very fast. I think that vampires especially come up against that because they don't necessarily look monstrous all the time. So then you start getting into this subject of like manipulation and like leading someone by like seducing them. And then that's how we get versions of vampires like Dracula, as opposed to like Nosferatu, who is obviously, you're not going with him because he said something alluring. Like it's a totally different experience. And I think vampires are completely understudied. And I think that race and sexuality are key to anything involving vampires, even if there's no diversity in either of those areas, because it is almost about being like you can be a chameleon in a lot of cases, right? Like you don't necessarily have to have people know everything that's going on with you, but like someone who's a werewolf, like that might be a little harder to hide. However, that's something that happens. It's like a transformation that happens to turn someone into something. But with vampires, like it often feels like the act of becoming one is somehow involved with like your own salvation or preserving something or letting go of restraints. And I think that is why like they've been so kind of like bastardized by the general like horror film industry and even like other industries. I think people just lose sight of like the depth of a vampire because it can just look like a regular actor. And so they lose that connection to what vampirism is actually about and what it's trying to, you know, explain to us about our own world.
I love that. I have more questions, but I just want to see if any folks in the class do. Yeah, please.
I guess this
Do
is,
you want to come up actually? So we can substitute that in that offer.
I was gonna ask, I don't know if you, because obviously this is more of like we do more like books
because it's an English class, but we've watched some movies, but I was just curious if there's any current like horror novels that you are interested in or recent ones that you're interested in that you think are particularly like either related to this or you just really enjoy, because I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I probably would have to say I do like to read, but not as much current. I can admit a lot of the stuff that I read like already like happened. I haven't read too many like very current texts, especially novels, but I'm very obsessed with like reference books and, you know, books that just sort of like break down horror in a bunch of different ways. So I have a ton of those. So there's a book called Horror Freak that I think is very cool. I think it really delves into the kind of work that I'm doing and like expands on it. I would also recommend The Dread of Difference. That was the first text I read that helped me understand that my views weren't exactly like wild, like that they weren't just they weren't coming out of nowhere, and that I understood what I was looking at. So if I just had to recommend two books to kind of like reference and get into like the depth that's happening for me in terms of horror, like The Dread of Difference and Horror Freak are two really good ones.
Anyone else? I have maybe one more question, which is just, I was curious, you mentioned when you were collecting some of the data for around community resources, that you were interested in like whether or not folks have stairs and these sorts of questions of access and mobility. And I'm just wondering if the of that data, or like if it's like the sense of like how folks relate to horror films, because it makes me think of the kind of spaces we typically see as available in horror, like the shift from like the old like manor to like the apartments of like Cabrini Greens and so on. And just curious what those sort of demographics about space tell you about folks' attachments to fear and such in the horror film.
Oh, thank you. That's a good one. Yeah, that information it helps me, one, understand recommendations, because what I noticed when I did my trial survey was that most of the people who lived in a house, as in like it's not apartments, it's not a triple decker, like one house that was larger, like they tended to be more afraid of films that were depicted in those environments, like whereas like something else felt unreal to them because they have no like personal grounding in it. So I've been able to extract some really interesting information out of that. I extracted a lot of information about spaces and also like who you're around. Like a lot of people who love dogs, for example, like didn't really like movies, not necessarily where dogs were hurt, but where they were like used as a negative force, which I found really interesting. Like it wasn't so much that they were getting hurt, it's like people didn't want to address the idea that a dog could be like dangerous, and so they tend to shy away from those, or those were the films that, you know, they didn't have any interest in. So I was able to get an idea of like how relating to a space or a person or a culture or an experience is at the forefront of what you consume, like the media you consume, even outside of like horror films. It just seems that there's way more attached to that than, you know, we like to think. And that's what I was able to extract from the survey, just these really like interesting points and cross sections that I was shocked by. But yeah.
I'm so grateful for this resource. It's one, definitely, I mentioned perhaps having you back in the Blackness and Horror class, because I think particularly thinking about the logics of death and the relationship to trauma just seems so important. So I thank you too for introducing that within vampire history for us as well. So I'll be sure to circulate all the links you shared with us today to my class, and to also get the poll sent out. But thank you so much for coming in to Zoom in with us.
Oh yeah, no problem. Thanks for listening, everyone. I appreciate it. Okay.
All right, take good care, Abby.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Yeah.